Imani Carter had been on her feet for 11 hours when the vending machine on the third floor ate her last dollar and gave her nothing back, which felt about right for the kind of week she was having. She smoothed the wrinkles out of her light blue scrubs, the fabric gone soft and thin from 100 washes, and checked the clock above the nurse's station one more time before her shift finally ended. 22 years old, 6 months into her first real job at Cedar Grove Memorial, and she still hadn't gotten used to the particular exhaustion that came from holding other people's pain in her hands for 12 hours straight. She loved the work. She just hadn't expected love to cost so much. Rent had gone up $40 that month, a detail her landlord delivered with the same flat indifference he used for everything, and Imani had done the math 3 times before accepting that something would have to give. She had already given up the gym membership. She had already started buying the store brand of everything. The only soft thing she had left, the one small indulgence she'd promised herself since she was a little girl watching her mother stretch a grocery budget into miracles, was the birthday cake she ordered every year from Hannah's Bakery on the corner of 5th and Wilcox, a place tucked between a dry cleaner and a phone repair shop in the part of the city everyone called Koreatown, where the woman behind the counter always remembered her order without asking. Vanilla bean, strawberry filling, her name written in careful cursive icing. It cost $38. She had exactly 31 left until Friday. She pulled her phone out in the stairwell, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and typed out the cancellation message before she could talk herself out of it, because talking herself out of it would only mean canceling something else later, something that mattered more, like the copay for her inhaler refill. She hit send. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a second longer than it needed to, and then she put the phone away and told herself it was fine. It was just a cake, and she walked out into the evening air already rehearsing the version of tonight where she didn't think about it again. The bus home was late, the way it always seemed to be on the nights she needed it most, and she stood at the stop with her arms crossed against the cold, running the numbers again, even though she already knew them by heart, because some part of her kept hoping a different total would appear if she just checked one more time. She should have known that walking into the bakery in person to apologize for the cancellation was a mistake, but Imani had been raised by a mother who did not let people down over text message, and so she found herself pushing open the glass door of Hannah's Bakery anyway, the little bell overhead announcing her like it always did, the smell of butter and sugar wrapping around her the way it had every year since she'd found this place. The woman behind the counter, a soft-spoken older woman named Grace Hahn who had run the shop for as long as Imani had been coming, looked up with the same warm recognition she always offered, and something about that warmth, offered freely to someone who had just canceled on her, was what finally broke the dam Imani had been holding shut all day.
She didn't sob.
She wasn't a sobber, but her eyes filled fast and hot, and she turned her face toward the display case, pretending to study the pastries so no one would see, her breath catching in small, private hitches that she hoped, no one would notice in a bakery that had 2 other customers scattered near the window.
She was wrong about that.
A man had come in behind her, close enough that the bell had rung twice, though she hadn't registered the second sound over the noise in her own head. He did not say anything at first. He simply stood a respectful distance away, near the counter, and Imani became aware of him the way you become aware of weather changing, a shift in the air before you understand why. When she finally looked over, embarrassed, wiping quickly at her face with the back of her wrist, she found a man watching her with an attention that felt entirely different from the polite, non-looking most strangers offered a crying woman in public. He wore a charcoal suit cut close enough to suggest it had never touched a department store rack, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and his eyes were a dark, still brown that seemed to be doing more calculating than the situation called for. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer the empty kindness of a stranger performing concern. He simply turned to Grace Hahn and asked, in a voice pitched low enough that it felt private even in the small shop, what the woman had ordered. She canceled it, Grace said gently, glancing at Imani with an apology already forming. Then uncancel it, the man said, and he set a black card on the counter with 2 fingers, the gesture so unhurried it barely registered as movement at all. Whatever she wanted. Add whatever she didn't ask for, because she thought it cost too much. Imani's spine straightened so fast it startled her. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, though not unkind, because 6 months of triage nursing had taught her exactly how to speak to someone who thought their money bought the right to make decisions about her life. I didn't ask you to do that. I know, the man said. He didn't look defensive. He didn't look amused, either, the way some men did when a woman pushed back, like her refusal was a game they were winning. He simply looked at her, steady, unblinking, in a way that made the small bakery feel smaller. You didn't have to. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling the woman behind the counter to make your cake. He turned back to Grace before Imani could formulate a response sharp enough to match the moment. Whatever she wants. Today if you can manage it. Grace Hahn, who had known this man for exactly as long as it took him to walk through her door, which was to say not at all, looked between the two of them with the particular delight of a woman who loved a good story unfolding in her own shop, and said she could absolutely manage it. Imani opened her mouth to object again, and the man, for the first time, allowed something close to a smile, small and controlled, the kind of expression that suggested he rarely wasted them on people who didn't earn it. You can be angry with me on a full stomach, he said.
Sit down.
Let the woman do her job. His name, she would learn a few minutes later, when Grace addressed him with the easy familiarity of someone who had clearly seen his face in the neighborhood before, was Ji-hoon Yoon, and the way Grace said it, with a note of careful respect that didn't match the casual way she spoke to everyone else, told Imani something she wouldn't fully understand until much later, that the man sitting across the small round table from her, unbothered and unhurried, was not simply a wealthy stranger with more money than sense. He was something else entirely, something the neighborhood knew to speak carefully around, and Imani, exhausted, embarrassed, and still faintly furious at having her tears witnessed by a stranger in a $5,000 suit, had no idea yet that she had just been noticed by a man who did not notice people by accident. Grace busied herself behind the counter, and once, when she thought neither of them was looking, she gave Imani a small, private glance that carried something like a warning wrapped inside encouragement, the look of a woman who had watched this particular man walk past her window for years without once stopping to sit down at one of her tables, and who understood, in that instant, that whatever had just happened in her shop was not ordinary kindness. Later, while she boxed the cake with careful hands, Grace would tell Imani quietly that the neighborhood had a name for men like him, though she never said the name out loud, only that people who mattered to men like him tended to stay protected in ways most people never noticed until they needed it. She learned quickly that Ji-hoon did not make small talk the way other men did, filling silence with questions designed to keep a conversation moving forward without actually going anywhere. He asked her one question, direct and specific, about where she worked, and when she told him Cedar Grove Memorial, something in his expression shifted, subtle but real, a small recalibration she couldn't name yet. He asked what she did there. Trauma nursing, she told him, mostly nights, mostly the kind of chaos that didn't leave room for hesitation. He nodded slowly, like the answer confirmed something he'd already suspected about her, the steadiness in her spine, the way she'd pushed back against him within seconds of meeting him instead of accepting his money the way most people accepted things offered by men who looked like him. You don't like being handled, he said. It wasn't a question. No, she said. I don't. Good, he said, and something about the way he said it, quiet and certain, made her feel like she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Grace brought the cake out 20 minutes later, vanilla bean with strawberry filling, her name written across the top in the same careful cursive it always was, and Imani felt the sting return to her eyes for an entirely different reason this time, because it was such a small thing, a cake she could have afforded most years, and yet the weight of the last 6 months, the rent increase and the skipped meals and the quiet grinding fear of being 22 and barely keeping her head above water. In a city that did not care whether she drowned, all of it seemed to collect behind her ribs and press outward until she had to look down at her hands to keep herself steady. Ji-hoon didn't reach for her. He didn't offer the kind of comfort that assumed permission. He simply sat across from her, present and unbothered by her silence, until she found her voice again. Why did you do that? She asked, finally, once she'd gotten her breathing back under control. Because you were trying not to let anyone see you, he said. And I saw anyway. Seemed like the least I could do, was make sure the reason for it went away. He paused, considering something before he spoke again, the way she would learn he always did, weighing his words like they cost him something to spend. I don't often see people cry over something small enough to fix. Usually it's the things I can't touch. He didn't elaborate on what those things were, and Imani, sharp enough to recognize a door closing when she saw one, didn't push. Not yet. He left his number written on the receipt before he left the bakery that evening, no explanation, no expectations stated outright, just 7 digits and his first name beneath them, and Imani sat with that slip of paper in her coat pocket for 3 full days before she used it, telling herself the entire time that she wasn't the kind of woman who called strange, wealthy men who bought her birthday cakes, even as some part of her that had spent 6 months exhausted and unseen kept circling back to the particular way he had looked at her, like she was a puzzle worth solving rather than a problem to be managed. Her co-worker Yvette caught her staring at the folded receipt during a lull on the unit one night and asked what had her so distracted, and Imani, unable to explain it in any way that sounded reasonable out loud, simply said a man had bought her a cake, which made Yvette laugh so hard she nearly dropped a chart until she saw the look on Imani's face and realized her friend was not entirely joking. Yvette pressed for details anyway, the way she always did, and Imani found herself describing the suit, the stillness, the way he'd looked at her like a problem worth solving rather than a woman worth pitying, and by the end of the story Yvette had gone quiet in a way that surprised her, saying only that a man who paid that much attention to a stranger crying in a bakery either had a very good heart or no heart at all, and that Imani should be careful finding out which. She called him on a Tuesday, not because anything had happened, but because a woman 2 floors down from her apartment had been found unresponsive in the stairwell that morning, and Imani, rattled in a way her job usually protected her from, found herself needing to hear a voice that didn't sound like it was asking her to be strong for someone else. Ji-hoon answered on the second ring, and when she told him what had happened, stumbling slightly over the details, he didn't offer platitudes. He asked what she needed. That question, so simple and so rarely asked of her by anyone, cracked something open that she hadn't realized was sealed shut. They met the following week at a restaurant 3 blocks from the bakery, a quiet place with low lighting and a menu that didn't list prices, and it was there, over food she couldn't have afforded on her own salary, that Imani began to understand the shape of the world Ji-hoon actually lived in. He didn't tell her outright what he did. He didn't need to. It was in the way the restaurant staff addressed him, in the careful distance the other diners kept without seeming to notice they were keeping it, in the 2 men who sat at a table near the door who were clearly not there for the food. When she finally asked him directly, because 6 months of trauma nursing had taught her that avoiding hard questions only made the eventual answer worse, he set down his fork and looked at her with the same steady attention he'd given her in the bakery. "I run an organization," he said. "It moves money. It moves influence. Some of what it does is legal. Some of it is not. I'm not going to lie to you about what I am, Imani. I've done that with no one in a very long time, and I'm not going to start with you." He watched her absorb that, watched the calculation happen behind her eyes the way he'd watched it happen in the bakery, and when she didn't immediately push back from the table, something in his shoulders eased, fractionally, like a held breath finally released. "That's supposed to make me trust you," she said. "Telling me you're dangerous. It's supposed to make sure you have all the information before you decide anything," he said. "I don't lie to people I want to keep around." It was the closest he had come, in the 2 weeks she'd known him, to admitting he wanted her around at all, and the admission sat between them heavier than anything else he could have said. She walked home that night instead of taking the car he offered, needing the cold air and the noise of the city to think clearly, and by the time she reached her building, she had decided nothing except that she was not yet ready to decide anything, which felt, at the time, like its own kind of answer. She lay awake a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the calm way he had told her exactly what he was, no flinching, no softening, and she understood, even then, that most people spent their whole lives being lied to more gently than that. The danger found her before she was ready for it, the way danger always seems to arrive exactly when a person has convinced themselves they have more time than they do. It happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the bakery, when Imani left the hospital late after a double shift and found her car in the parking structure with all 4 tires slashed and a note tucked under the wiper blade that didn't need to say much to make its meaning clear. "Tell your friend we know where you work." She stood there in the concrete stairwell of the parking structure with her hands shaking, not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but from the sudden, violent understanding that her small, careful life, built brick by brick out of exhaustion and discipline and $31 stretched until Friday, had somehow become collateral in a war she hadn't known she was part of. She called Ji-hoon before she called the police, and she would spend weeks afterward wondering what that said about her, about how quickly the boundaries of her world had shifted to make room for him. He arrived in 11 minutes, faster than should have been possible, and the 2 men who came with him were not soft-spoken the way he was. He crouched beside her car, studied the note without touching it, and when he stood back up, something in his face had gone very still and very cold, an expression she had not seen on him before and hoped never to see aimed anywhere near her again. "This is Han Suk-won's work," he said, mostly to the men beside him, though Imani heard every word. "He's testing whether I'll bleed for something that isn't the organization." "Am I something that isn't the organization?" Imani asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Ji-hoon turned to look at her fully then, and for a moment the calculation in his eyes disappeared entirely, replaced by something rawer, something he didn't seem to have planned to show her yet. "No," he said. "That's the problem." He explained it to her later that night, in the back of a car with tinted windows, the city sliding past in smears of light while one of his men drove them somewhere she didn't ask about, because Han Suk-won was a rival who had spent 2 years trying to carve territory out of Ji-hoon's organization through patience and small provocations, and Ji-hoon's refusal to react to any of them had apparently convinced Han that there was nothing in his world soft enough to threaten. Imani, a birthday cake and a bakery bell and a handful of dinners, was the first soft thing anyone had found. "I should walk away," she said quietly, watching the buildings blur past the window. "That would be the smart thing, the safe thing." "It would," Ji-hoon agreed. He didn't try to talk her out of it. That, more than anything he could have said, was what kept her from reaching for the door handle. "I'm not going to tell you to stay, Imani. I've built my entire life on making sure the people around me understand exactly what danger they're standing in before they choose to stand there. But I'm also not going to pretend I want you to go." She stayed. She told herself it was because leaving now, with her tires already slashed and her name already known to men who wanted to hurt Ji-hoon through her, wouldn't actually make her safer, and that was true enough to hold on to in the daylight. But at night, lying awake in the guest room of the house he insisted she stay in until the immediate danger passed, a house with security cameras at every entrance and a quiet, watchful man stationed near the front gate, she admitted to herself the fuller truth, that some part of her had already decided she didn't want to be the kind of woman who ran from something simply because it frightened her. She had built a career on walking toward emergencies other people fled. This didn't feel so different, not really, except that the person at the center of the emergency had started to matter to her in a way she hadn't planned for and couldn't fully explain. The house itself unsettled her at first, too large and too quiet in a way her small apartment never was, and she found herself wandering its halls in the early mornings before her shifts, cataloging details the way she cataloged a new patient's chart, the absence of family photographs, the single locked room at the end of the east hallway that no one ever mentioned, the careful, deliberate emptiness of a life built to withstand loss rather than invite it. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm she hadn't expected to find comforting, shifts at the hospital sandwiched between careful, watch trips to and from Ji-hoon's house, dinners where he told her more than she suspected he told most people, about the older brother who had raised him after their parents died, about the year that brother had been killed by men Ji-hoon still hadn't fully forgiven himself for trusting, about the code of loyalty and precision he had built his entire life around because chaos, uncontrolled and unpredictable, was the thing that had taken everyone he'd ever loved. He told her this on a night when the rain hit the windows in long silver streaks, his voice quieter than she'd heard it, and Imani understood, with the particular clarity of someone who spent her professional life reading pain in other people's bodies, that she was being shown something he did not show easily or often. She found herself, without entirely meaning to, reaching across the table and resting her hand over his, and he went very still under the touch, the way a man does when he is not used to being reached for rather than reaching, and neither of them said anything about it, though both of them understood exactly what it meant. Later that same week, she asked him, carefully, about the locked room at the end of the east hallway, and something closed over his face so fast she almost regretted the question, until he told her, quietly, that it had belonged to his brother, and that he had not been inside it in 3 years, and Imani did not ask again, understanding that some doors needed to stay closed until a person chose, on their own, to open them. "You're the first person in longer than I can remember who made me feel like something other than the man everyone in the city is afraid of," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something physical, a visible easing of tension in his jaw that she hadn't realized had been there the entire time she'd known him. "I told myself letting you stay here was strategy. Keeping you safe, keeping Han from using you against me. I've been lying to myself about that since the second night." Imani didn't answer right away. She sat with the words, turning them over the way she turned over a difficult diagnosis, checking them against everything she'd observed instead of accepting them on their surface. "I've been telling myself the same lie," she finally said. "That staying here is just practical. Just safety." She looked at him, steady, the way she'd looked at him in the bakery 3 weeks ago when she'd refused his money on instinct. "I don't actually believe that anymore." He crossed the space between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and when she didn't, when she met him halfway instead, the kiss that followed carried none of the hesitation either of them had been performing for each other since the bakery. It was deliberate. It was an answer to a question neither of them had been brave enough to ask out loud. When it ended, his forehead resting against hers, his hand steady at the curve of her jaw, he said her name the way he always did now, the 2 syllables carrying a weight no one else had ever put into them, and Imani understood that whatever line existed between the ordinary life she'd been living and the dangerous one she'd stepped into, she had just crossed it fully, with her eyes open. Han Seok-won's next move came 4 days later, and it was not subtle. He sent word through a channel Ji-hoon's organization monitored, an open challenge disguised as an invitation, a meeting at a warehouse near the harbor to discuss what he called a redistribution of territory, though everyone in the room when the message arrived understood it for what it actually was, a trap dressed up as diplomacy. Ji-hoon's lieutenants argued against him attending at all, and Imani, sitting at the edge of the room where she had increasingly been allowed to be present for conversations that would have terrified her a month earlier, watched him weigh the decision with the same careful stillness he brought to everything. "If I don't go, he tells every rival in the city I flinched," Ji-hoon said. "If I go alone, I walk into whatever he's built for me. Either way, I lose ground I can't afford to lose." "Then don't go alone," Imani said, and every head in the room turned toward her, including his. "And don't go exactly the way he's expecting." She laid out what she meant with the same precision she used when triaging a chaotic emergency room, thinking through angles and exits and timing the way she'd learned to think through a mass casualty event, and though 2 of his lieutenants looked skeptical that a hospital nurse had anything useful to contribute to an ambush, Ji-hoon listened to every word without interrupting, and when she finished, he looked at her with something that had shifted permanently from admiration into something closer to reliance. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain enough to be in the car with you," she said, which was not exactly an answer to his question, but it silenced the room all the same, because it made clear she had no intention of waiting safely at the house while he walked into danger for her sake. That night, before they left for the harbor, Ji-hoon found her checking the small bag she had packed out of old habit from the hospital, gauze and antiseptic and a penlight, and he asked her, almost gently, whether she expected to need it. "I always expect to need it," she told him. "That's the only reason I've survived this long in a job that doesn't forgive mistakes." The warehouse, when they arrived 3 nights later, smelled of salt and rust and diesel, the harbor wind cutting cold through the open loading bay, where Han Seok-won waited with a dozen men fanned out behind him in a display meant to remind Ji-hoon exactly how outnumbered he was. Imani stayed close to the car as instructed, not because she intended to remain there, but because the plan she'd helped build depended on her being underestimated exactly as long as it took to matter. She watched Ji-hoon walk into that warehouse with the same unhurried, deliberate stride she'd first noticed in the bakery. No fear visible anywhere in his posture, and she understood, watching him, exactly what Grace Han had meant weeks ago, with the careful respect in her voice. The confrontation unfolded fast once it started. The calm diplomatic tone Han had opened with dissolving within minutes into the true purpose of the meeting, an attempt to corner Ji-hoon between his own men, and a locked exit while Han's soldiers closed the loading bay door. Imani heard the shift in the voices before she saw it. The particular pitch that meant violence was about to replace conversation, and she moved exactly the way she'd planned, cutting along the warehouse's exterior wall to the electrical panel she'd identified during their earlier reconnaissance, killing the lights across the entire loading bay in one motion that plunged the confrontation into a chaos neither side had prepared for. In the scramble that followed, she was not a bystander waiting to be saved. She used the darkness the way she'd used chaos her entire career, moving with purpose while everyone around her scrambled to reorient, guiding two of Ji-hoon's men toward the side exit Han's soldiers had failed to fully secure, buying the seconds Ji-hoon needed to turn the ambush back on the man who'd built it. When the lights came back up minutes later, restored by one of Ji-hoon's men who'd found the panel Imani had already located, Han Suk-won was on his knees with Ji-hoon's gun leveled at him. The balance of power in the room reversed so completely that the outcome no longer required discussion. Ji-hoon did not kill him. He told him instead, in a voice colder than Imani had ever heard from him, that the next provocation would not end in a warehouse conversation, and Han, understanding the mercy for exactly what it was, a warning rather than weakness, left the city within the week. Imani found Ji-hoon afterward, standing near the harbor's edge with the wind pulling at his jacket, and when he turned and saw her walking toward him, whole and unhurt, and entirely by her own choice still standing beside him, something in his expression broke open in a way she hadn't seen before, not even in the quiet house on the rainy night he'd told her about his brother. "You could have stayed by the car," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't want to." He crossed the distance between them and pulled her against him, not gently, not carefully, but like a man who had spent the entire night believing he might lose the one thing he hadn't planned on needing, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was rough in a way she'd never heard it. "I built my whole life, so nothing could touch the people I care about," he said. "And you walked into a warehouse full of armed men because you decided that was your choice to make, not mine." "It was," Imani said simply. "It still is." He didn't argue with her. She would learn, in the months that followed, that this was as close as Ji-hoon ever came to surrender, not in words but in the way he stopped trying to build walls around the parts of his life she had already stepped into, the way he introduced her to the people who mattered to him not as someone he was protecting but as someone standing beside him, the way he said her name, still differently than anyone else's, but now without the careful distance he'd kept in the bakery weeks earlier. There was a cost to what had happened at the harbor. There always was in his world. Territory shifted and alliances recalculated, and a wariness among his rivals that had not existed before, an understanding that the woman beside Ji-hoon was not a vulnerability to be exploited, but a second mind that made him more dangerous, not less. One evening, weeks after the harbor, he finally led her down the east hallway of the house and opened the door that had stayed locked since she'd arrived, showing her a room kept exactly as his brother had left it, and the fact that he let her stand in that room with him, saying nothing, simply present, told her more about how far he'd come than any words could have. Imani went back to Cedar Grove Memorial the following week, back to 12-hour shifts and light blue scrubs and vending machines that occasionally ate her last dollar, because the ordinary world she'd come from still mattered to her, still shaped who she was, and Ji-hoon never once asked her to give it up. Yvette noticed the change in her before anyone else did, the new steadiness in the way Imani carried herself down the hallway, and when she finally asked what had happened, Imani only smiled and said some things were too big to explain over a shared lunch break, which was, in its own way, entirely true. On her next birthday, a year to the day from the evening she'd stood crying quietly in Hannah's bakery over $38 she didn't have, Imani found a cake waiting for her on the counter of Jihoon's kitchen when she came home from a shift. Vanilla bean with strawberry filling, her name written in the same careful cursive Grace Han always used, and beside it, no card. No explanation needed. Just Jihoon leaning against the counter with his sleeves rolled and his tie loosened, watching her the way he'd watched her that first night, like she was something worth being certain about. She didn't cry this time. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him instead, slow and sure, and when she pulled back, she found herself thinking, not for the first time, that the smallest thing in her life, a cancelled birthday cake, had somehow become the beginning of everything that came after, and that she would choose this, choose him, choose the danger and the quiet mornings and the particular way he said her name, every single time the choice came around again.